Hello and welcome to episode 28 of the Peter Podcast. I'm your host, reporter Taylor Clydesdale, and with me this week is Ian Peddle. Ian is running for council in the fall election for Ashburnham Ward, and today we talk a little bit about transportation in the city, especially when his wife was in labor when they were on Lansdowne Street.
On Lansdowne, and while I was inside getting the subs, my wife's labor got substantially better, and I had to drive up Parkway, go down Kinsella, take a left on Sherbrooke, and go to the hospital. And my wife gave birth about 20 minutes later. It was actually... So in any event, the thing I see about the Parkway is it's the only road allowance that leads to the hospital from north and south. And if you had a heart attack at Peterborough Zoo, or if you're sitting down in the South End or on the 115 and your kid runs into some distress, you want the Parkway there.
And we also talking about housing and development in the city, and as well as we talk a little bit about him and his experience and why he wants to run for council. So, hope you enjoy the show.
My name's Ian Peddle. I'm running for Ashburnham Ward as city council, and I'm a 31-year-old man. I've got a wife and 2 kids, and I'm a local lawyer.
Ah, how do you enjoy being a lawyer?
I do. I enjoy the people aspect of being a lawyer, I suppose. It's a lot of paperwork. I don't know that it's exactly the life that it is in Suits or Boston Legal, but I do enjoy speaking to people every day and trying to resolve issues for them.
There's a great YouTube series that I'm watching right now where it's an actual lawyer watches crime or court scenes from movies and examines how different they are from reality. It's a lot of fun, actually.
Yeah, no, and I think the biggest thing that anyone that gets involved in the justice system is the difference in time, right? Everything in the TVs happen in 45 minutes and over a 1-week span, where I've seen cases that have been in law offices for 15 years, and you go like, it's not, and it's boxes of paperwork rather than the exciting courtroom appearances. But you can do a lot of good things in the law, I think.
Yeah, I know our court reporter who sat in on trials before, he's been weeks and weeks and weeks tied up in just one case.
Yeah, I know, and I did a trial once, and I was asking one person questions for 6 straight hours. And I thought to myself, I'm getting bored at the end of this. Like, I can't imagine what the judge thinks.
Oh, it must take a special kind of patience to be a judge.
Oh, I can't imagine not wanting to sit there for 6 hours a day for 3 straight weeks listening to other people make arguments or ask questions. And it's one of those things because, like, a cross-examination, you're trying to get a very specific answer, but it could take you an hour and a half to get that answer. So you're just sitting there trying to close all the doors to get so that they have to answer a specific question a specific way. But yeah, if you don't know where you're going, like if you were someone watching it, you'd just think, I would rather poke out my eyes than spend another 3 minutes in this room. And the judge has to. They're getting paid to.
So, it seems like to be a lawyer, you have to be very skilled in legalese and know the law very well. Is there any crossover between, the skills as a lawyer and the skills that you're hoping to demonstrate as a city councillor?
Well, let's not give lawyers too much credit. Let's be fair. You have to be awake. No, I think there's some... obviously, what I do for a living involves me trying to understand issues rationally and put forward arguments in a convincing way. And I think that's a lot. That's what a good politician should be doing as well, is trying to understand the issues rationally, come to a conclusion in terms of this is the position I'm taking because A, B, C, and D. And then be able to put that position both in front of council and to his or her constituents and say, this is what I believe, this is why I believe it. If you can convince me that I'm missing something or otherwise there's something there that I haven't considered, then I'm open to changing my beliefs. But as of right now, this is where I am on that issue. So
tell me, why does he decide to run for council?
I think it's something that it's something where I think I can make a difference locally. I think I can help people. To be honest with you, I've got a young family, so a lot of me didn't want to do it because of the time commitment. And then my wife, who has known me for over 10 years now, said, I think you really should. And that was the final straw, which is why I entered the race a bit later than everyone, but I think it's something where I can help out.
Okay. So maybe we can talk about the time commitment because, as you said, you've got a young family, you're a practicing lawyer, and you would also be expected to, be a city councilor, which is a significant time investment itself. How do you plan on having that all on your plate at one time?
I don't sleep very much as it is. I've got a 4.5-month at home, so I've had 2 children relatively quickly, so I've gotten used to the idea of not sleeping anyways. So that might help. To be fair, the one benefit I have is I practice on my own now, so I can kind of scale back my practice to the extent that I have to work more in city council. But it is something that it was a real consideration for me, and it's something that it will take up some of my time, but I'm a pretty hardworking guy, and I'll do my best to try to do both.
Yeah, so, I think, talking to current city councilors, people who have been on council before, it's more than just the one meeting a week, or I guess it's one meeting every other week now, but... there's a significant amount of research that needs to go into it, public consultation, public meetings. So, there's a lot of time that goes into being an elected official.
Yeah, no, and I appreciate that. Like, I've been on boards and things like that, so I understand that just because you're on a board and you have a meeting once a month doesn't mean that's the entire commitment. And again, I'm really lucky to the extent that I'm married to a saint. So I appreciate, but I've been working 65 hours a week since I graduated law school. Like, there was times when I was articling, I'd come home at 2 a.m, I'd go to sleep for 3 hours, and then I'd get up and go back to work, and that's...
I do not envy your job.
You get
and you want to be a city councilor on top of that?
Yeah, no, I suppose it becomes, and but yeah, so I understand there'll probably be times that I've got to wake up at 3 a.m. to do the reading for that meeting at night because I've got things at work. But I'm a pretty hardworking guy. Like, I'm willing to put it in because I think it can be really rewarding.
Okay. Yeah, so you said that you'd served on some boards before in the community. Maybe you can tell us a bit about your experience with that.
So currently I'm the chair of Big Brothers and Big Sisters.
Oh, okay.
So I've been on that board for the last 4 years. I was on the Down Syndrome Society board. And then I actually went to law school in Queens, so I was involved in Youth Diversions there, which is a fairly large organization in Kingston working with at-risk youth. And then I was part of the Law Association board. So those are the boards I've been a part of. Okay,
so it sounds like you actually have a pretty extensive volunteer history as well.
Yeah, and most of my volunteer, most of it before I became a lawyer was more hands-on. I did a lot of volunteering with at-risk youth when I was in my 20s, or particularly in my early 20s. So I initially volunteered with the Children's Aid Society as a mentor in Guelph when I was doing my undergrad, and then in Kingston I did a lot of things with youth diversions and also a mentorship program with them. Now with my own kids I tend to do more board work, but yeah, I try to, I've been kind of, since I was about 20 anyways, I try to help out when I can, and I think that's what's motivated me even to get into this race.
Yeah, so we're going to dive into, after we take the break at about the halfway point, we're going to dive into some of the bigger issues like PDI, the Parkway, housing, but maybe you can tell me what it is you're hoping to accomplish on council.
I suppose what I'm hoping to accomplish in a general sense is I just want to come to council, be a rational voice that thinks about issues. I have a certain view on certainly where my values see the city moving in the next 10 years. They make sense to me. They won't make sense to everyone. And I hope to kind of look at the issues through the lens of those values and come up with decisions that benefit the most amount of citizens.
So where do you see the city moving in 10 years?
I think there's got to be a balance in terms of there's a lot of people in the city, and I think the city has a great pass and has a lot of great landmarks to that pass around the city. But if you're not growing, you're shrinking in my own mind. If the city isn't improving, it's decaying. You can't keep a city stagnant. So I want to see developments in the city and see new buildings and more apartments and more houses so that we have more affordable housing. And I want that growth to be responsible. But the idea that we should just try to kind of, and I don't think in fairness most candidates are saying we should stop all growth, but there's limits and people have different visions for what that should look like. And I would say my limit's probably not growth at all costs, but it's certainly not only growth if there's no cost.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I know, talking to people there was a 4-day design charrette a little while ago where some engineering and design consultants from Toronto came in. And a lot of what I heard from people who were in the community who attended those meetings, and I only attended during the one day, so I didn't get the full scope of everything that was said. But what I did hear from people was that they want to see Peterborough grow and continue to develop, but it has to maintain at the core of what Peterborough is. And what a lot of people see Peterborough as being is a community where it's kind of Ontario's or Canada's smallest city. We're not this big urban center. We don't have skyscrapers. We still have a lot of green space, and that's something that a lot of people want to see maintained.
Yeah, no, and that's the reason why I live here, in fairness. Like, I think, and some of that is Peterborough's also got a really great community that no matter what happens, it's always going to have that community in terms of there's just a tremendous history here and there's great people here. And listen, I went to law school. I'm not practicing on Bay Street for a reason. I really love what Peterborough is. I think it's great that it has all this green space and you can get across town in a reasonable amount of time and go to festivals all through the summer. But on the other side of things, I've got working clients that can't find places to live. So, there's got to be a balance there. It can't be one or the other entirely. Because you can't sit there and say, well, we want to keep Peterborough what it is. Well, it's not going to stay what it is if the only people who can afford to have houses are making $150,000 a year. So, there's going to be decisions there no matter what. You can't put a city into a time capsule.
Mm-hmm.
So I appreciate that sentiment. An incredible amount, but I think that's where we're already seeing it to a certain extent in terms of if we don't have development, we're going to have an affordability crisis.
And we are going to dive a little bit later into the housing topic and really explore that more in depth. But before then, I want to ask, are there other types of growth that you would like to see in Peterborough other than just housing?
Well, I think particularly, some of why I got involved in this race is particularly as it relates to Ashburnham. I think there could be further development of that ward. It seems strange to me that there's only one daycare that I can figure out on that side of the river. So I've got to drive my son out to the West End in order to put him in daycare, and it's a lovely daycare. But I'd prefer not to have to drive 30 minutes or 15 minutes in one direction to turn around and come back when I drop him off. So, and I think Ashburnham, we have Beavermead Park, and there could be more use of the public space there. And then I think I'd always be in favor of there being more green space, more parks. I think the other thing that's gotten a bit of attention is I tend to have the view that the Memorial Centre should get replaced as a main entertainment centre in town. So those are kind of the things I've been looking at.
Yeah, where do you think that should go? I think that's kind of the big question that a lot of people are asking right now.
In terms of which?
The Memorial Centre replacement, the potential Memorial Centre replacement.
So I don't have a great answer for that because I think there's a few different places that I've heard. I'm not sure, and some of them are privately owned, or I think most of them are privately owned. So I think that's an issue in terms of coming out and saying it needs to be in that place. It makes your negotiating position in terms of buying that place not the best. But I think it should be somewhere probably close to a downtown core.
Okay.
Because it makes sense to me to kind of draw people into that type of area.
Yeah, and I know there is a spot that the city has directed the consultants to look at. It's city-owned property at, what are the streets that it's on? It's on Wolf Street, and I forget what the bordering streets are, but it's on Wolf Street. And that's one spot that the consultants are currently looking at for a potential spot. It's just kind of just out from the downtown, but...
Yeah, and that would make sense, too, to me, to a certain extent. Like, there's things that there's places where I think, but they wouldn't actually be that educated, if you know what I mean. To the extent that, like, I sit there and I go... Armour Heights, if you're going to put it in East City, Armour Heights School's about to be closed, so I don't know what's happening with that space. And I actually have no idea whether that's a reasonable suggestion or not. It could very well not be. And then you look at the space around GE, and you look at places closer to downtown that could be potential, or Dalcreary Park.
I mean, the whole GE thing is kind of a separate debate because there's a lot of contaminated land in that area, and the city is kind of... Well, everybody is looking at it kind of going, what do you do with that spot?
Yeah, and again, I don't know. It could be just an outrageous cost. So I'm not suggesting to you today that, like, a hockey rink should go to where GE is. Because if someone said to me, sure, that's a great idea at $300 million, I'd probably sit there and go... It's not that great of an idea, but if that made sense, it's actually, in terms of a position in the city, it's relatively close to downtown, and it's relatively close to major arteries that you could control the traffic and control parking in the area. It might make some sense.
Yeah, it's a fantastic spot.
And
something's got to be done with it eventually.
Yeah, and that's the thing. It's often kind of in other places too. They've had similar issues because. Factories in the early 20th century weren't that clean of spaces.
No.
And they tended to be on the water for whatever reason. And a lot of that is just rising real estate prices will eventually make it so that it makes sense for someone to do something with that space. Because if you look at Kingston downtown, the entire waterfront at one point was contaminated, and now it's been developed since because of the rising real estate prices. So at some point or another, I think that area will be developed in a way that benefits the city. But it'd be interesting if you could put a hockey rink there.
I think it'd be a great spot for a hockey arena. It's just that I think what people fear, and it's my fear as well, is that property is going to sit around for decades and nobody's going to want to touch it because it's too expensive to remediate that land. But I mean, eventually something's got to be done with it because it's such prime real estate. You don't want that to be a giant black site where nobody wants to touch it, nobody wants to acknowledge that it's a problem, and everyone just kind of drives around it every day going, it'd be great if someone did something with that.
Yeah, no, and the other side of that site is that, frankly, there's issues, as I understand it, in terms of space in Peterborough for factories that want to relocate here, or could want to locate here, and maybe that's what it ends up just getting refurbished into a new type of industrial complex. Mm-hmm. I tend to think it would be preferable to have industrial complexes more on the outskirts of cities and then better stuff in the center of the city where GE is.
I mean, if you consider it, GE was at the edge of the city.
Yeah, at the time, but so in my own mind, if it was possible, I'd rather have something else on the GE site and have the factories somewhere further away from residential areas. Mm-hmm. And you got to think, when GE was built, most people were walking to work, so it made sense to have a lot of houses around your factories.
I mean, all those homes were at one point owned by GE families who...
Yeah. You'd get up in the morning, you'd walk to work, your kids went to Prince of Wales. It was a pretty nice actual walk.
Yeah.
You could get your whole life sorted out in 5 minutes.
Back before you knew that all the ground under your feet was contaminated with PCBs and TCEs.
I suppose. But now I think most people would probably prefer the city to be planned a little bit differently. Mm-hmm. And like most people don't mind taking the 10-minute drive to work to have a factory that's not right beside their kids' playground.
Well, we're going to talk about city planning, but we're going to do that in just a few short moments because we're going to take a short break and then we're going to come back and dive into some Peterborough issues. How does that sound?
Okay, thanks a lot.
Awesome. We'll be right back. Yeah, so if you want to dive into, let's get back into things.
Okay.
And let's talk about some things that people in Peterborough care about. So right now, we're kind of at a critical juncture with the Pdi Sale. It seems like it's kind of too late to go back. So I'm not sure what it's worth to talk to people about it at this point, but at the same time, it's could still be an election issue.
Well, I think there's certainly an issue of what happens with the funds that come in from the Pdi Sale. I'm not sure realistically what new council's going to have to say about the deal, because it does sound like it's a bit of a done deal. So I think a lot of the question becomes, if there is $55 million there at the end of the day, what do we do with it? How do we invest it? Is it something that we use to pay down debts? Is it something we do to build new roads or build new parks? Or is it something we invest and we try to use that, instead of having the PDI dividend, have a dividend off the money that you receive from PDI?
Okay.
So that we're building kind of a bit of a something for the future.
So what do you mean by that? By investing it to get a
return of some sort. Like my understanding of the math, and I'm doing this off of memory, so I could be a couple $100,000 off in terms of things. My understanding is that the expectation was that PDI was going to pay the city about $400,000 to $500,000 a year in dividends if the city had maintained ownership. So you're looking at $55 million roughly. If you went and invested that at 4%, that would end up being $2 million in change that would be coming to the city every year. So do you do something like that? I've heard talk about investing it back into the generation of power.
And there were a few projects that were planned for that money to be reinvested to, but unfortunately, because of the change in government, and those projects are no longer happening.
So so it really becomes, and that'll just end up being a value call, I think, in terms of there's no real right answer.
Yeah, no, and I think, when it comes to budget time, which if elected would be your first budget discussion, I think the question of where the $55 million is going to go is that there's a lot of places that it could go. Yeah. Do you put it into the capital budget and afford these big, expensive capital projects, including, as we were just talking about, the potential memorial center replacement? Do you put it into roads? There's a lot of road projects in Peterborough that need to get done. The Charlotte Street and Bethune Street redevelopments are two big examples of that. So there's a lot of money, or there's a lot of projects, that you can put $55 million into.
Yeah, and I don't know exactly where it should go, in fairness, but I would tend to lean more towards it should be staying in something capital related. Like I wouldn't want it to be used as an operating money, because the people who lived here before built that kind of legacy for the people who live there now, and I think we have a bit of an obligation to leave the same legacy or a better legacy for the next generation coming along. So just spending it all on roads instead of dealing with the roads issue by ongoing city revenue wouldn't be the right way to honor that kind of legacy. So I do think it should go into something that benefits not just the people today and the people for the next 5 years, but the people who live in the city for the next 50 years.
So just to get to the core of the issue, do you support the sale of PDI? Would you fight it at all from going through if you were elected, or would you just kind of deal with the hand that you've been dealt?
My initial reaction to the PDI sale, I think, was the same as everyone's initial reaction. Is that you hear of the sale of PDI to Hydro One, and one, I didn't really understand what PDI was, and two, Hydro One doesn't exactly have the best reputation in the news currently. So my initial reaction is, why is the city doing this? You get into the numbers though, and we talked about some of them in terms of you've got it's first I didn't understand it was just we're selling poles and transformers. I thought we were selling all of Peterborough utilities when I first heard about it.
And that still is a pretty common misconception that that's what's happening.
So when you look at the numbers, absent me missing something, it seems like power is going to be cheaper. We're going to have better jobs, and we're going to have money that if we invested at 4%, which is a pretty conservative investment, would be doing better than the dividend we would getting on PDI. I don't know if I'm missing something, in fairness, but it seems like a good deal to me.
And I know there are a lot of people who, just disagree with the sale just on the principle of, utilities and power generation and all that should be kept public and not private.
Yeah, and I believe in public corporations and public goods and providing public goods. Like, certainly we shouldn't be selling the library. But for-profit industries, I think to the extent that the city has to be in those industries, I'm not one of those people. The city is, sometimes it might make sense, but if we've got a deal like this one that it appears on its face, in fairness, no one's seen the final paperwork. So I'd reserve the right to kind of look at the final paperwork, and as a lawyer, I'd tell you there's 1,000 loopholes for everything. But when it seems on its face is it protects the consumer, which is important because that's what the city's meant to do, is protect its citizens. And it protects jobs, which is important because the city should be in the interest of trying to make sure there's good employment for its citizens. And it protects the city's finances. So if someone can tell me an argument against PDI, selling PDI, absent the argument you just told me, that I just don't believe in it and I wouldn't believe in it if they offered us $1 billion, if you can come up with some other reason to tell me why we shouldn't sell PDI, I'm all ears.
I mean, there are a lot of people who are afraid that, at that 11th year mark, once the rate freeze and the limitations on the rate increases end, that, at that 11th year, Hydro One is going to jack up Peterborough's rates to an unreasonable amount. The city has said that because hydro rates are regulated, that wouldn't be the case, but there are still a lot of people saying that, well, at the end of the day, it's Hydro One who would be applying for that rate increase, and it would be Hydro One responsible for that, not the city.
Yeah, no, and I understand that, but there are regulations to kind of control that, and in the interim, as I understand it, and I stand to be corrected, PDI was going to raise rates a lot higher than Hydro One was going to, or was going to be forced to. So it seems to me that there's an economy of scale there that ends up being better for everyone. I'm not a huge fan of Hydro One, but I think a lot of kind of making a decision based out of fear is not a good way to make a decision. Saying that, the world could fall apart in 10 years. Yeah, in 10 years we could all have batteries in our home and solar panels on our roof, and PDI and what those poles might not matter at all. 10 years, we could all have electric cars. I don't know what 10 years is going to bring. You can only make a decision based on the best information you have right now, not what you could be possibly scared of 10 years from now.
Okay. So we're going to move on to the next topic then, and we're going to talk about transportation, particularly when it comes to transportation in the city, the Parkway issue. There's a lot of people who...
Yeah.
No, that's a good snicker. But... there's a lot of people who want to see the Parkway built. There's a lot of people that say never build the Parkway. There's a lot of people who say build the Parkway, just don't build that god-awful bridge over Jackson Park.
Yeah.
What are your thoughts on the Parkway and improving transportation in Peterborough in general?
So I tend... it's the same thing similar to PDI. When I first heard about the Parkway, I took the position no Parkway. I've now come to the position after kind of again getting into it. I read the 2012 city report on roads, and I've looked at it, and I think the third option that you mentioned in terms of a parkway with roundabouts that avoid the bridge makes the most sense to me. The reason I say that, though, is probably different than most people. Is I sit there and I go, and I've said this story to other people. My daughter was born about 4.5 months ago. And we were at the hospital, and we got told, well, you're not in enough labor, so you can stay if you want, but leave if you want to go grab something to eat. So we went down to Firehouse Subs on Lansdowne, and while I was inside getting the subs, my wife's labor got substantially better, and I had to drive up Parkway, go down Consilla, take a left on Sherbrooke, and go to the hospital. And and my wife gave birth about 20 minutes later. It was actually so in any event, the thing I see about the Parkway is it's the only road allowance that leads to the hospital from north and south. And if you had a heart attack at Peterborough Zoo, or if you're sitting down in the South End or on the 115 and your kid runs into some distress, you want the Parkway there. And that to me is the overriding factor. I think if we end up, what's being proposed with the Parkway is essentially a 2-lane road with a path beside it. I'd like to see more paths in the city in general and a more extensive biking infrastructure. But to me, it doesn't have to be on the road allowance that leads directly to the hospital.
That's interesting. So for you, it's that, not just the south section, but the north section as well. It all contributes into providing further access for those emergency services and the hospital as well.
Yeah, I think it is the only way to have that in terms of limiting the distance to the hospital. Or if you're on your way to Lakefield and something happens, or you're on your way to Lakefield and your wife starts giving birth. Like there's nothing in life that scares me more than the idea that I would have to deliver a child.
That'd be a great story. The Parkway made it so I had to deliver my child on the side of the road, or the lack thereof.
The lack of the Parkway. And in fairness, you don't know. Like you have, there's a lot. Your kid gets stung by a bee while they're out and goes into anaphylactic shock because you're out on the Autonomy River. Like there's a lot of situations that I think you'd really want the Parkway to be there.
Yeah.
And it's not really a parkway is the other thing I always find funny about that debate. Like what's being proposed now is a 2-lane road.
Mm-hmm.
Like in terms of when you think about a parkway, I think there's often this idea that it's going to be like the Don Valley just blowing through Jackson Creek Park. What we're really talking about is a road like half the roads in Peterborough. Like Charlotte Street, essentially.
Okay. Yeah, and I know right now the question is just, is the cost on the Parkway too high? Because we've seen the cost rise, tens of millions of dollars, and we're at the point now where there might be a $1 million or $6 million environmental assessment that needs to be done before anything happens. So is the cost of the Parkway starting to get too high that it's just not worth building anymore?
And that's something where I could be convinced on. Like in fairness, I don't have that kind of anti-Parkway to the extent that I would never build one. If someone could say, here's the amount of money it's going to take to build the Parkway, and if we spend that money A, B, C, and D, we're going to have the same result or a better result, then I could be convinced on that. But as I've looked at the numbers in the past anyways, the Parkway's always been the more cost-effective versus the alternatives. If that changes, then my position would probably change.
Okay. Sounds like you're pretty flexible when it comes to that kind of transportation solution around the city.
It seems to me that everyone should be. For whatever reason, it's turned into this really emotional issue.
I mean, I think especially when it came to the Jackson's Park thing, there were a lot of people who said, can't have Jackson's Park being built over because that's where I play with my children, or that's where I grew up. And I think especially, for the Parkway route now, a lot of that is a lot of green space that's sat vacant for a few decades now. And that's space, too, that people are starting to get an emotional attachment to as well.
Yeah, no, and I appreciate that. And I particularly appreciate the bridge over Jackson Creek Park, which is why I don't support the bridge over Jackson Creek Park. But cities change, right? Like I had this idea this morning actually while I was coming in here, and you might, so I don't actually remember much from the movie because it wasn't a very good movie in my own mind. But the final scene of the movie of Gangs of New York, if you remember it.
No, I've never seen that movie.
Okay,
sorry.
But it looks across at Manhattan from the other side of the river, and then it does a time lapse from whatever the time period of that movie is, like the 17th century or 18th century to late 1990s, and it shows the change of Manhattan over that time. Like that's what happens to cities if they don't. You've only got two. You either become Manhattan or Detroit. City's gonna change, and we'll build emotional attachments to new green space. But the idea that, what we have, we can't ever get rid of, like it's going to have to change in some ways, or you become Detroit.
Well, let's talk about how the city would develop and grow. And I mean, we've already touched on that a little bit earlier, but specifically in regards to the housing market as well. Because right now we're dealing with a housing crisis. We have a high cost of housing, of purchasing housing. It's really a seller's market at the moment, and our vacancy rental rates are at all-time low. So how do you develop and grow your city to be able to have people, have a place to live?
I think it's there's a lot of debate around that type of issue, but I think it's you have to encourage development to a certain extent, because the city can't be in the housing business itself. Like, we're not going out there and building houses. Absent, there's obviously some low income housing and things like that, but we're not building 2-story houses for families. But in terms of what we're feeling right now is kind of issues in terms of, some of it'll be just that people didn't necessarily put the money into Peterborough, but some of it has been, there's always been a huge resistance to any type of development. And you run into situations like, there's even resistance, and I know there's people running against me that didn't want to have the pig's ear, wanted to keep the pig's ear. And you sit there and you go, the pig's ear is what the pig's ear is, but if you can't find a place to rent, you want there to be more apartment buildings. Mm-hmm. And so we have to kind of think about that in terms of development. If we're gonna have places where a young family can afford to buy a house, or a young single parent can afford to buy a house and raise their kids, we're going to have to encourage more houses to be built. And we're gonna have to have places where if you're working and you're trying to get an apartment, there's gonna have to be more apartments.
Yeah, and I know there are probably some people out there who, they look at the Jackson Park Trail as an example, or they look at the Pig's Ear and they say, these are some identifiable Peterborough landmarks, and they might think that it's a slippery slope that to develop these things into, a road or apartments, because it would take something away from what we identify Peterborough as Ontario or Canada's smallest city. Yeah. Which I'm not sure how true that claim actually is nowadays, but still, it's a popular claim.
But Peterborough is the people of Peterborough are what makes Peterborough. Like, at the end of the day, there's certain things that I understand. Like, you can't knock down an entire pass of the city. And I appreciate that. I'm not saying that we want to turn downtown Peterborough into downtown Toronto. And, reasonable people can disagree. I have an office right around the corner from the Pig's Ear. I walk by it. I don't see a whole lot there in terms of that doesn't create pride in me in the city. But reasonable people can disagree. If you think that, then, then we just happen to disagree on that issue. And there are buildings downtown that I think are stunning. And I would hate and would be totally against them ever getting touched in the way that we're doing it to the Pig's Ear potentially. But I think that's again kind of this fear-based decision making where you sit there and you go like, I'm scared Peterborough's changing. It's going to change, but I think what makes Peterborough what it is the people who live here, and that's not changing. And I think that should give people some comfort.
Okay. We're just about to run out of time now, so I'll leave it with you. Is there anything else that you want to add or that you think we've missed?
No, I just, I've really enjoyed talking to you. I hope people have gotten a better idea about me, and if you have any questions, feel free to contact me. I'll be going out there and knocking on doors there shortly, so if you want to chat to me about any of these issues, or you think there's something that I'm not considering, throw it at me.
All right, awesome. I look forward to seeing you on the campaign trail.
Thanks a lot.
Awesome. Take care now. And for everybody else, we'll see you next week.